Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. In this clip, I have Dr. Peter Kreeft and Jordan Peterson, and they are basically two philosophers making sense of the entire world, of all of the thoughts that you have ever dreamed of thinking. So in this clip, we have Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, objective morality and the problem of radical evil. We have a clip on Karl Marx, Pascal, and Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky. I can never say his name, but I think you know what I'm talking about. And they just so happen to throw in biblical citations from Genesis to Revelations. Let's go.
Second, that's the grammar of being. And the theologian is tempted to change that grammar of being and play God and almost call God into existence through his concepts. That's the great danger of being a mere theologian.
So this idea here, this is another idea that's relevant on the issue of the question of whether what needs to be put in the highest place is a spirit or a description. So the other thing that I found very much characteristic of thinkers like Harris and Dawkins, and this is probably even more true of Harris because Sam Harris is extremely obsessed by the idea of radical evil, which he believes in devoutly, I would say, and has been looking for a means of producing, let's say, an objective morality as a counterpoint to the existence of absolute evil as manifested, let's say, in genocidal atrocity. And so in some sense, it's accurate to say that his heart is in the right place. But like stemming off from that is this observation, which is that Harris and Dawkins and scientists of their ilk also implicitly accept the idea, I believe, that truth has to be nested inside love in order to be properly motivated scientifically, and I think psychologically as well. They have to be operating on the assumption that this search for knowledge is going to be beneficial to humanity in the particulars and in the generalities. And so that's a orientation that's essentially predicated on love, and that truth, the scientific truth, has to be the handmaiden of that broader ethical concern. Does that seem reasonable to you?
It's reasonable unless you are someone like Karl Marx, who once said that his favorite line in all of human literature is from Goethe's Faust, where Mephistopheles, the devil, utters these words: "Everything that exists deserves to perish." That is what I would call absolute evil.
I can't believe that, because that's a phrase that I've used repeatedly in my lectures, because Goethe has Mephistopheles actually say that twice. He says it in the first, there's two books to Faust written very far apart in Goethe's life, when he was a young man and then when he was a much older man. And he has Mephistopheles utter that credo in two different forms. And he basically says, elaborate on what you said, that Mephistopheles' position is that it's like Ivan Karamazov in the Brothers Karamazov. He says, life is so rife with catastrophe and suffering, betrayal, malevolence. It's so intrinsically unworthy that it would be better if consciousness itself was just brought to an end. And I didn't know that Marx made reference to that. That's absolutely stunning, because it is the core ethos of Mephistopheles, and so a core satanic ethos, let's say, that non-being is better than being. It also contradicts the statements in Genesis. This is something very striking about Genesis, which of course you no doubt know, is that when God steps through the days of creation, using the word to engender order out of chaos, he insists after each phase, let's say, that what has been created is good. So not merely that it exists, but that its existence is good, and that goodness is preferable to non-being. And so one of the issues that I've struggled with is the notion that part of what the biblical narrative does is outline for its adherents a pathway of existence and perception, so of action and perception and social interaction, that best enables our participation in creation to be the good that overcomes suffering and malevolence.
And not just the good that overcomes suffering, but the good that overcomes evil. there's two very different kinds of evil. There's the evil that we do, that we're responsible for, and then there's the evil that we suffer, harm. And the human heart wants both. It wants to love and be loved. It wants to be good and experience good. And if the truth is that those two things are impossible together, if evil is stronger than good and not surrounded by good, if, in other words, the benevolent God who created the universe is a myth, and the universe is the ultimate being, and there's nothing beyond it, then the universe is very much like Red Butler in Gone with the Wind and says to us, frankly, my dear, I just don't give a damn. It's beyond good and evil. And I don't know if there's a proof that such a God exists or not, but it's certainly an option. It's a Pascal's wager. You can believe that in the mind of God, there is an adequate and more than adequate reason why God allows these horrendous evils, even though he can miraculously stop them. Or you can believe that there is no such reason. And I love Pascal because he's very practical. He says, well, you cannot be refuted, whichever of those two wagers you pick. There is such a God, there is not such a God. But look at the consequences for life. Even if you're wrong, your life is meaningful and it gives you hope and it gives you order. And if you're right, then you'll find out in the end that you were on the true path. And if you're wrong, well, maybe at the moment of death, you'll find out that it was all an illusion. But even the good illusion is better than nothing.
Well, let's take a Kierkegaardian twist on that. I noticed that you all have also written about Kierkegaard, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I derived from Kierkegaard. So, because Kierkegaard talks about this idea of being a knight of faith, and he's classed with the Christian existentialists as a consequence of the practicalities of his view, he basically puts forward a proposition that I think is akin to the proposition that undergirds marriage, which is you cannot find out, and this is relevant to Pascal's wager, you cannot find out whether creation as such is good or evil without being all in on your bet. Just like you can't be married without saying, well, I'm shackling myself to you and I'm not going to run away no matter what, so we better get to know each other and get along because this is how it's going to be. And without that, you can't be deeply committed enough to the marriage to make it work. So it seems to me on the forefront of faith, which is you have to act in the world with courageous trust, not naive trust, but courageous trust in the potential goodness of being in order to actually discover whether or not that faith is justified. And so and that's partly why it's faith, is that you have to put the cart before the horse. You can't wait around. You know, in the book of Revelation, when Christ comes back to judge everyone, he says something like, if you were neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. And so his harshest judgment isn't reserved for outright, unrepentant, committed sinners, and certainly not for people who are 100% committed to the courage of their faith, but the judgment is harshest for people who play both ends against the middle and who won't commit. And one of the things that I've started to toy with is the idea that faith is actually a subset in some sense of existential courage. You know, I've talked to my listeners and viewers about the notion that if you want to pursue the good, you do that in some sense despite. So if you're naive, you're good because you think everything is good and everyone is good. But if you're naive, you're immature and you're unwise. And then you get jolted out of that naivety by betrayal and tragedy. And then you become, or you're tempted by cynicism. And the cynicism is wiser than the ignorant naivety. But it's not good. It's the desert, let's say. It's the Exodus desert after the tyranny of naivety. And the way out of that is to evince a courageous faith. And the courageous faith is something like, I'm going to do good despite the evidence for tragedy and malevolence and the atrocity of history and all of that. And that's part of the courage of faith. I'm going to commit myself to this. And that, in some sense, bypasses Pascal's wager, because it doesn't even have anything to do, in some sense, with, what would you say, your own redemption. It's a decision about how to be in the face of the catastrophe of life. And you have to make a decision one way or another, because you're either going to take the Mephistophelian route and say, you know, life is so terrible that it should just come to an end, and that if there is a God, he should be damned for having the presumption to make such a terrible world. Or you're going to say, no, despite everything, I'm going to work in all possible ways to make everything better and to tell the truth while moving forward. And I'm going to conduct my life according to those principles, and then I'm going to have the adventure that comes along with that and see what happens.
That's what the scientific atheist does not understand, I think. That there are some truths that you cannot simply discover. You have to live them. You have to make the experiment. I think of Kierkegaard's Night of Faith from the viewpoint of Juliet. Here comes Romeo with no guarantees. He does not bring an array of lawyers and philosophers to persuade her that it is utterly rational for her to elope with him. He says, leap into my arms. And she does not know whether that will end well or not. It's an act of faith. It's a leap. And in the play, of course, it doesn't pay off. They both die. Or you might say that even that, since it was, in a sense, a noble death, was a payoff. But there's no guarantee. That's why there's faith.
Yeah, well, there's this idea from the materialist determinists, let's say, that if we just derived enough information about the nature of things, that we could produce an algorithm that would enable us how to compute our movement forward.
Now, that is naive.
The problem with that, it is naive. Well, I think it's technically naive, because I've talked to some great scientists like Sir Roger Penrose, and Penrose believes that, in principle, the horizon of the future is not fundamentally predictable from the positions of the past. So this is not a clockwork universe, that the horizon of, that what we've confront is a horizon of potential, which I think of as somewhat equivalent to the chaos that God confronted at the beginning of time, that we confront this potential that has multiple potential branches, which is the way that the world could array itself as a consequence of our decision, and that we impose a vision on that, and that vision is a production of faith, and then we enact the vision, and that enacting is an act of faith. And that's part of what's attracted me to the existential thinkers, let's say, rather than the scientific materialist determinists.
I would not use the word impose. I would use the word add. Whether the universe is a clockwork universe or not doesn't much matter, because our lives are not clockwork lives. So that we can add to the universe new data by our choices, by our living. And what effect that has on the universe, I don't know. I don't know if the stars tremble a little bit when we love each other more or not. I suspect that there's some connection, because spiritual gravity and physical gravity have to be at least analogous. And if every particle of matter in the universe is relative to every other particle of matter in the universe, why shouldn't every particle of personality, every individual human being, and their choices and their loves and hates also have effects on everyone? That's the Russian concept of sobornost, which is so strong in Dostoevsky, especially the brothers Karamazov. I love Ivan Karamazov. He's my favorite atheist. He's passionate, he's committed, he's moral. He's a moral atheist. He's not an amoral atheist.
Yeah. Right. Well, and he's admirable, and he's charismatic, and he's good looking. And I mean, one of the things that's so absolutely wonderful about Dostoevsky, which puts him in the top rank of all-time geniuses, I actually prefer Dostoevsky to Nietzsche in the final analysis, I would say, although it's a tight battle, is that when Dostoevsky makes an atheist, he pulls out all the plugs, man. And so I know in the Brothers Karamazov, Ivan wins pretty much all of his arguments with Alyosha, because he's so articulate and so able to put forward his claims. Although Alyosha beats him on the characterological side, which is one of the great, what would you say, brilliant literary accomplishments of Dostoevsky. It's really something.
I don't think anyone in history has ever written fiction about Jesus which moves you, except Dostoevsky. And in The Grand Inquisitor, Jesus says nothing and does nothing except for that kiss, and that's sufficient. And it looks as if Ivan won the argument earlier than that, because Ivan got Alyosha to admit, if you were God and you were creating a universe and you gave man free will and you saw that it would inevitably result in these horrors, these parents who are torturing their children, would you consent to be the architect? And Alyosha, who's utterly honest, says, no, I wouldn't consent. So there is an Ivan in Alyosha. There is a rebel in us, and it's a good rebel. God approves Job's rebellion rather than the three friends' comfort. At the end of the book of Job, God says an amazing thing. He says to the three friends, I burn with anger against you because you have not spoken rightly about me as my servant Job has. But what they said was simply orthodox. It's in the rest of the Bible. God is great and God is good. Let us thank him for our food. Amen. And Job, who admitted that his words were wild because his sufferings were so great, is accusing God and wishing that he could take him to court. And yet God approves that honest rebellion on Job's part rather than the comfortable acceptance on the part of the three friends. Dostoevsky must have loved that.
There are just a few observations that I would like to make. The first thing that really stuck out to me was Jordan Peterson's explanation of the satanic ethos. And he explains how non-being is better than being, this idea that not existing is the satanic ethos. And that got me thinking about kind of the contrast or the opposite, which would be the God ethos, right? So the God ethos, in contrast to the satanic ethos, would be that being is better than non-being. This really makes sense to me because it helps me to make sense of the fact that something part and parcel to God's universe is life. And on the flip side, it also helps me to answer the objection that atheists often make that death is meaningless or doesn't have any point. If the God ethos is true, that would be fundamentally flawed and false. The second thing that was very interesting to me was Dr. Peter Kreft's statement when he said, the good illusion of God would be better than nothing. Now, I don't want you to misrepresent that in your mind. What he's ultimately talking about there is Pascal's wager, which is basically an argument for why you should believe in God. And it basically goes like this. If God exists and you believe, you gain infinite happiness. In other words, if God exists and you believe, you get eternal life in heaven. Secondly, if God exists and you do not believe, you suffer infinite loss, meaning if God exists and you do not believe, eternal damnation in hell is waiting for you, okay? So those are the two scenarios if God exists. If God doesn't exist and you believe, you lose nothing of significance. Perhaps the worst thing that could happen to you if you believe in God and he doesn't exist is you lose some temporal pleasures or time spent in religious activities. That's number 3. Number 4, and the second of the insights into if God does not exist, he says, if God does not exist and you do not believe, you gain nothing of significance. And I think this is kind of the atheistic position. You simply live your life as an atheist, and what does it really matter? But the issue here for Pascal is the wager. You see, if God does exist, there are eternal consequences here. And if God doesn't exist, there aren't eternal consequences. So it's a bet. I mean, why would you not want to believe God exists, especially if he does exist, the consequences are so great. That's kind of his logic. And I think it is a perfect argument. It makes perfect sense to me. And the third thing that I really liked in this video is how Jordan Peterson explained faith is a subset of existential courage. Okay, faith is a subset of existential courage. Why I like this explanation so much is that faith isn't a mere theory, but action. And the Bible is just full of this reality that faith isn't a theory, but it is an action. The crowning example of this is Abraham. And a great treatise on this would be Kierkegaard's book, Fear and Trembling. It's a great read that helps to explain a lot of what they're talking about with Kierkegaard in this video concerning the leap of faith and how Jordan Peterson interprets Kierkegaard as faith as a subset of existential courage. All right, that's all I have for this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.